Hi, good evening. The title of this talk is The Future of Africa. I should begin by saying that my expertise is not with the whole continent, but only with some pieces of it. So what I'd like to do is to give you some notes from the areas that I cover for Human Rights Watch, followed by some thoughts about business and human rights, and then specifically some comments about Japan, China, and influence of different countries over the African agenda. But first of all, I'd like to introduce a little bit about Human Rights Watch, what we do, where we are, and how we work, for about 5 minutes or so. And then we'll play a short DVD, which will give you an introduction to some of the work that we do in Congo in particular. So for those of you that don't know, and for those of you that weren't here when our Executive Director Ken Roth spoke yesterday, Human Rights Watch is a global advocacy organization, and our advocacy is based on research. So we start with about 100 or so researchers all around the world who look at different human rights problems, from Congo to Uzbekistan to Colombia, Cuba, the United States, Europe, anywhere in the world really where there are pervasive human rights problems. We get first-hand testimony from the ground. We turn that into reports, which we then publish. And then on the basis of those reports, we do advocacy with governments, with corporations, with rebel groups, with whoever is in a position to influence the situation to improve those human rights violations or to amend those human rights violations. At the moment, our headquarters is in New York, but we have offices all over Europe. We have 3 offices currently in Africa, in Johannesburg, in Nairobi, and in Dakar. We have opened a Tokyo office 2 years ago, and that's just been complemented by a New Delhi office, as well as researchers in the field in all of those places. Our newest office is in Sao Paulo, which is opening, I think, next month. In total, we are, as I mentioned, we're about 100 researchers. That's a third of the organization, so we have a very heavy focus on research. But beyond that, the total staff is about 300. We're looking to expand that to 400 or 500 in the next 5 years, growing quite quickly. Our annual budget is around $50 million. And you may have heard of Amnesty International, which we're very often compared to. Amnesty is a much larger organization with many more employees. The principal difference is in the membership of those 2 organizations. Amnesty funds itself principally through membership, so people join and they pay a fee. And it also has more of a focus on campaigning rather than on research. Human Rights Watch focuses much more of its resources on the research, on getting first-hand information, and we don't have any members because in a way we like to be a little more flexible. We don't want the members to determine our agenda. We receive no money from any governments. All contributions, all the revenue and operating costs of Human Rights Watch are met from private donations. Our largest private funder is George Soros, who gave us a challenge grant, you may have heard, of $100 million over 10 years. So that's 10 million a year, which we are hoping to match, and that's about 1/5 of our budget. So that's the details. Maybe we could watch a DVD now about Human Rights Watch on the ground in Congo, and then I'll go on with a bit more information about the areas that I cover, business and human rights, and some thoughts on Japan. Am I in the way? Okay. Let me come there.
Congo is one of the richest countries in Africa. It is endowed with immense mineral wealth. It has copper, cobalt, uranium, gold, diamonds, you name it, Congo has it.
When its collapse began in 1994, when Mobutu Sese Seko left office, Congo kind of went up for grabs.
And those who lived in those rich mining areas were the ones who seemed to suffer the worst.
They used to use the local population to mine for them, almost like slaves, and then take the gold from here and ship it out towards Uganda. And then from Uganda it went to Europe and was traded on the international markets.
These are people who should be rich, who should be benefiting from the gold. And of course they're not.
Local groups were saying to us, people are being massacred, women are being raped, people are being killed because of our mineral resources.
Congo is a huge country, and it's a mess. It's chaos.
There are some 5 million people who have lost their lives as a result of the conflict that has taken place there. And it's a complicated conflict involving not simply the Congolese army, but a proliferation of local rebel groups, many of them backed by neighbors of Congo, including Rwanda and Uganda.
There were several foreign armies in Congo. There are close to 9 countries involved. You have militias, you have armed groups who are accountable to nobody.
The first and most fundamental step that Human Rights Watch takes to make change in a place like Congo is to establish the facts.
Excusez-nous pour le dérangement.
To establish facts on the ground is absolutely essential.
Et ils ont affronté avec le FARDC.
When I go and do these investigations, I talk to dozens and dozens, sometimes many more, witnesses, eyewitnesses, victims, trying to piece together exactly what happened, who was responsible, and what needs to be done to change it.
The most important thing is you're talking to people who, in some ways, cannot do anything about what has happened to them. They cannot get the justice that they seek. And they need someone else to do that for them, someone else to provide the voice for them. And that's what this work actually entails.
That was
Like a crushing of the skull?
Yeah, it was like...
The fighting has really revived intensively in the last year or so. And people suddenly realize that there is the risk of massive bloodshed again, massive killing, massive rape. And a critical role that Human Rights Watch plays is that of sounding the warning bell, sounding the alarm, making clear that there is a rise in atrocities, and now is the time to act to curb them.
There is one constant in Congo. Every time the bullets fly, every time armed groups fight, it is civilians who pay the price.
Over Christmas this year, the Lord's Resistance Army, also known as the LRA, a rebel group from Uganda, went into parts of northern Congo while people were eating or finishing their Christmas dinner, and they massacred them.
We immediately got on a small plane and went to this remote corner on the border with Sudan, and then found the witnesses. One led us to another, to another.
Here in the town of Faraj, they waited till everyone had finished their church services, and then they attacked the town, killing people brutally with axes and with bats to the head, basically crushing their skulls.
Our researchers are trained intensively over the years so that even where there are warring factions and people may hate the other side, they learn how to cut through the tendency to lie or exaggerate or color the facts and to get at what actually happened.
We were able to gather first-hand, fresh evidence about these massacres just days after they happened.
Oui, vous voyez un peu rouge ici, c'est le sang.
We made lists and names of the people who'd been killed, the people who survived.
We took that information both directly to policymakers by calling them up, by knocking on their doors, and we also, of course, took the information to the press.
We're taking photographs of people that can then be distributed to newspapers and magazines all over the world. We're taking video that's going on international broadcasting stations.
I think the great strength of Human Rights Watch is to call the attention of the world on a conflict that was essentially ignored, where the international community wanted to look the other way.
One thing we were able to do is to convince the UN Security Council to deploy additional peacekeepers and to give those peacekeepers the means and the mandate to begin to protect civilians. I was just in Congo over the summer, and I went principally to look at the explosion of rape and sexual violence committed this time not only by the rebel groups, which people are almost accustomed to now, but increasingly, indeed a majority of the time, by the army. We went to try to stop that.
Congo is probably one of the worst places in the world to be a woman or a girl. 200,000 women and girls have been raped in eastern Congo since 1998.
Walitingilia mwetu usiku, wakiwa babangu na mamangu. Tulikuwaka wafie mbili mie na mloko wangu. Kisha wakiwa vitu vyetu vyote na si wakitupiga. Sasa walitupigaka wakenda na si mpori ile usiku tu.
Many of the women had fallen pregnant because of the rape, and they had been thrown out of their homes. What do you say to this young girl whose life has been destroyed because of rape?
Anneke van Woudenberg has talked so extensively, in such detail, over so many months and years, to so many hundreds, if not thousands of people. Just ask them the simple question, what happened to you? What did you suffer? When? Who did it to you? Just the basic questions.
Human Rights Watch repeatedly brought evidence to the table which emphasized the real scale of the problem. We've been working on this for years now. Our first report on sexual violence in Congo, the war within the war, was way back in the early 2000s. And we have kept at that issue.
What was important is that Human Rights Watch was able to gather testimony that clearly illustrated that the rapes that were happening were not individual soldiers going off, that this was a systematic campaign against a civilian population.
No one likes to be known as a human rights abuser. And so when Human Rights Watch researchers can uncover the facts, when we can document abuses, that information is powerful.
Les soldats de l'armée congolaise ont eux aussi perpétré des crimes de guerre contre les civils.
We reported that the army itself is responsible for the majority of the rape today. But the most important thing we did was we met with President Kabila. And 2 days later, the Congolese army announced a zero-tolerance policy for rape, exactly what we had asked Kabila to do.
The issuing of the decree by President Kabila is an extraordinary achievement because that decree is not going to stop rape altogether, but it will send a very powerful message that the most important man in Congo is saying, this is not okay, it is unacceptable.
It's not just government leaders and government officials who are eager to avoid being named and shamed by Human Rights Watch. It's even rebel commanders.
This grainy clip of film is at the heart of a trial at the International Criminal Court, which accuses the Congolese militia leader Thomas Lubanga of recruiting and training child soldiers.
Well, the International Criminal Court is the court of last resort. So that means that if there are no national proceedings, then the International Criminal Court can take up the case.
Thomas Lubanga ist der Erste, der dieses neue Konzept...
Human Rights Watch indeed collected evidence about Thomas Lubanga's use of child soldiers, his rebel group's use of child soldiers, and we handed this information to the International Criminal Court prosecutor that led ultimately to the prosecution of Lubanga, the fact that he's on trial today.
Il a commis certains des crimes les plus graves, des crimes contre des enfants.
I was in northern Congo when the trial opened, in the town of Bunia, which is where so many of the atrocities had taken place. And I sat amongst a group of 400 or 500 people crammed into this tiny church hall as we watched the images come across from what was happening in the trial. And it was one of those extraordinary moments when I saw justice starting to work.
It gives a message to the people that, look, these warlords, they will be held to account. They are deflated. They are afraid of being brought to The Hague.
Ending impunity is a key because we have found that in the past where serious crimes have not been addressed, the same perpetrators have come up again and perpetrated or carried out or committed further atrocities.
By collecting information, by putting pressure on the actors, we can force them step by step to curb the atrocities and to begin to put in place the systems, the rule of law, that will help to prevent a recurrence of these atrocities.
There's something about Congo that pulls me back again and again and again. It breaks my heart, and yet it gives me immense hope. Congo is a horrible and yet a wonderful place, and I think we have to do all we can to keep telling the stories of what is happening there.
Okay, I hope that wasn't too long. Is that still? We are good. I think that last phrase from my colleague Annika sums up for a lot of us, at least at Human Rights Watch, who deal with the underbelly of some of the things that are going on there, is that Africa, and Congo perhaps as an extreme example, can be both a horrible and a wonderful place. And I think the ingenuity, the entrepreneurial spirit, the opportunities that exist there are something that are increasingly attractive and interesting to other nations, other people. Everyone's noticed China taking a much more aggressive position in Africa, and to some extent India. But we have also noticed Japanese diplomatic steps in perhaps a much more quiet way. I think the big deals that China makes on natural resources are perhaps not the Japanese approach. What we've seen from Japan has been much more quiet diplomacy with the TICAD process, the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, the latest of which was a conference there in May. But this sort of softly approach on climate change, coupled with support for the Security Council, with a doubling of aid to Africa, at least promised, it hasn't been delivered yet, seems to be paying dividends and earning a diplomatic reputation for Japan, which I think is very necessary. There are a lot of pitfalls with going for the big natural resource contracts that China's gone for, that India's gone for, and to a large extent which have been fueling the conflict in Congo. Of course, there are many conflicts in Africa which appear to have or have some natural resource link, whether that's diamonds in West Africa, whether that's coltan, tin, gold, manganese, etc. in Congo, oil in Sudan, oil in Libya, oil in the Niger Delta, oil in Angola. All of those natural resources have to some extent or another bred instability. Now, instability, the definition of instability and how it's guaranteed, the definition of stability and how it's guaranteed has some bearing on instability. Now, instability obviously is not good for investment. It's not good for anybody who wants to bring out those natural resources in Congo in a productive way, or anybody who wants to work in the Niger Delta in a sustainable way, or in Sudan, or in Libya, or anywhere else. Part of my message this evening is that it doesn't have to be that way. For those of us who work on the ground and who take these testimony, for example, in Congo, Annika did a lot of work on those gold mines that you saw at the beginning. She documented the forced labor, the violations that were happening in the mines, the process by which the gold went to Uganda, was smuggled to Uganda in violation of Congolese sovereignty, and was then exported to Europe. And she had a very healthy engagement over a long period of time, 18 months, with Anglo Gold, based in South Africa, who were mining there and who were also buying and have played a big role in the gold economy in Eastern Congo. And got a number of concessions over time with that company, to the point where that company was then leading others to change their practices and change their behavior in Congo, because it benefited everybody. You know, it's not simply the fact that we are shouting about rights violations in natural resource conflicts that makes it a PR problem for companies. Actually, rights violations are bad for business in and of themselves. not just because somebody's talking about them, but if you have, a transparent framework, a healthy workforce, a workforce that's well remunerated, that's, committed and so on, and is working for its own agenda, and you have a sympathetic local population there as well, everybody benefits. And the net result over time is a positive circle rather than a negative one of increasing instability. So I think, as I mentioned, Japan taking more of an interest in Africa now, along with China, along with India. For all of those countries, and I think for anybody who's interested in seeing Africa become a viable economic partner, stability is key. And I would hope, especially now with Japan having established a military base on the continent in Djibouti with 160 troops this week, I would hope that Japan will now become more interested in promoting stability on the continent. So I just want to unpack a little bit what that means. In the past, Britain, the United States, even China have been accused of fostering instability because it's good for them, because countries at war mean that those are countries that are weak and therefore their natural resources can be exploited cheaply and easily. Now, I, for one, don't believe that that's in their interests, and I certainly don't believe that it's some kind of conspiracy theory to keep Africa down. But what has been true is, I think, a short-sightedness in the way in which both governments and companies have interacted with Africa and with Africa's people, or let's say with African governments and with African peoples, and I think there's a difference there. And that short-sightedness has actually led, especially during the Cold War, to some very unhealthy alliances. We've seen David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, Barack Obama from the US, talking about the Middle East and how we got it wrong. We supported some of the wrong guys, and now we're learning and we're going to do it differently next time. That's great. However, at the same time, they're doing exactly the same thing south of the Sahara as they've always done in the Middle East and across the continent. So there are dictators such as Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, Kabila, who you saw there, although he's won a couple of democratic elections, his credentials are pretty shaky. Kagame in Rwanda. These are, very difficult people at the head of increasingly abusive bureaucracies. In the case of Eritrea and Rwanda, extremely so. But the idea that, especially in the Horn of Africa, which is my area of expertise within Human Rights Watch, it's been thought that we need, a strong man that we can rely on, a guy who can deliver security, who we can do business with, who will do the West's bidding in terms of sending his troops into Somalia against Al-Qaeda, friends we can rely on. As I think it was Henry Kissinger said about Pinochet, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And that realist school appears to be, I'm afraid, still alive and kicking, despite what may have been happening in the Middle East lately. Now, from a human rights point of view, stability is not about autocracy. Stability is about deep-rooted democracy, something that's fostered over time with respect for human rights, with respect for freedom of speech, with respect for the people's right to choose their own leaders, and so on. Now, and I think Japan has a very unique perspective on that in the Southeast Asian, in the East Asian and Southeast Asian region. You have several examples nearby of other countries where, there is an apparent stability, although actually underpinned by probably quite a lot of instability and unrest and social discontent, which over time will grow. It will have consequences. And on a much more real scale, that's what we have in Africa. So often the kinds of conversations we're trying to have with foreign offices, with governments, with diplomats, is to try and persuade them to our view of stability over a much longer time horizon. We're talking about 30, 40, 50 years. We're not talking about 5 or 10. So to give you one anecdote about Ethiopia, when we had this conversation recently, and I'll get into Ethiopia in a bit more detail, with the British ambassador, we pointed out the single-party state, the dictatorship, and so on, all of which was not news to him. He said, yes, I hear you. It's going to be a train wreck sooner or later, but not while I'm here. Now, he's talking about his own career, but in terms of British interests, they go beyond his career. And as a British taxpayer, I would like to think that my representatives are thinking a little more long-term about, you know, what the benefits for my country and our relationship with this other country, rather than diplomats looking down the end of their retirement. So that's stability. The other thing I'd just like to define is development, because this is what certainly in the English language is most often used in relation to Africa, that Africa is full of developing nations, and that we should be promoting their development with the UN Millennium Development Goals and so on. In and of itself, of course, that's a nice idea. There is social and economic development, there's civil and political development, there's some kind of industrialization. All of these things, the government of Africa, the people who are trying to help those governments and people, all have, to some extent, different ideas of what they're trying to do. There is, let me give it a shorthand, the Chinese model, which says, or the Asian tiger model, perhaps, which says you don't need civil and political rights in order to have development. You can have, what people care about is the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to jobs. Social and economic development without civil and political rights. And in fact, civil and political rights, like a free press or freedom of speech, if you talk about things too much and you raise too many objections to dams or to forced villagization or to relocation or to things like this, then actually you're clipping the wings of the government. You're limiting its ability to deliver development. And that's a bad thing. Now, I would say that most African governments, whatever they might say in public, practically subscribe to that model of development. Meanwhile, you have the UN Millennium Development Goals with the Millennium Declaration, which says on the first page, social and economic rights go hand in hand with civil and political rights, and that a population requires freedom of speech, good governance, democracy, ways of holding the government to account to make sure that the government delivers on the social and economic rights, the right to food, education, healthcare, jobs, and so on. That you can't have one without the other. This is the theory of development, and this is also the international policy of development, if you like, the one endorsed by the UN, the one which all governments, including the Japanese one, sign up to nominally with the Millennium Development Goals. They all say that this is what they believe. However, in practice, what we often see is is the implementation of programs which deliver improved healthcare, improved education, food aid, and so on, while remaining completely silent on civil and political rights. Governments, Western governments in particular, the UN, may spend a little bit of money on capacity building of journalists or something like that. But they'll spend $1 billion on social and economic rights, on big infrastructure projects, on that kind of economic assistance. I'm not saying these things need to have a lot of money spent on them, but they need to be given equal weight. So our most recent report, which I think some of you have on handouts, is called Development Without Freedom in Ethiopia. And this is where Ethiopia, we criticize the Ethiopian government and the donor governments because about 3 billion of international money, including money from international institutions and Japan, was being spent on, is still being spent on big infrastructure projects and big social development programs by the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian government was using those programs, continues to use those programs selectively, so that those who develop, as it were, those people who have access to social housing, to food aid, to jobs, to university places, to promotions if you're working in the civil service, to land, to fertilizers and seeds and so on, the people who get access to those benefits are people who carry the card, who are members of the ruling party. So it's as though the ruling party here is the version of the Labour Party, is that right?
Right,
DPJ. It's like saying, you know, your social goods you cannot access unless you're a member of the DPJ, unless you hold a card. So you would not be at university, teachers would not be getting professional development unless they were paid up members of the ruling party. It's kind of like North Korea in a way, Ethiopia, although it doesn't receive, it's not seen in the same way in the international media. But that level of manipulation was going on because in every village in Ethiopia there is a cell of 5 households with a party chairman who reports up the chain in this very hierarchical, autocratic sort of Maoist system. Now I mention that because often people talk, you know, people think about development in Africa and aid and business as kind of 2 sides of a coin, that they're somehow different, that, you know, these are different approaches to, you know, ways of assisting the population. But the way I'd rather look at it is actually in terms of the people and their government. And, you know, while a government is perfectly able to be, you know, to be corrupt and to use profits and so on for its own ends, even development assistance, even money which is supposedly coming to help, which is very specifically focused on health and education and social welfare, is still being used as a tool to promote the hegemony of a single government. So let me say then a little bit more about the individual countries that I work on, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about business and human rights more generally. I've sort of introduced business and human rights, but I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit and talk about these countries. So I've told you about that situation in Ethiopia. Similarly, in Eritrea, we have a single-party state. We have, in effect, a dictatorship. Isaias Afwerki's been there since 1993. Again, a very stiff, rigid country that may look stable in the sense that nothing's changing, but actually what that means is it's unstable, because Eritrea generates more refugees per head of population than any other country. So there are literally thousands of Eritreans fleeing across the border into Sudan, into Ethiopia, and across the Red Sea into Yemen every month. The main reason that they're fleeing is because everybody between the age of 18 and 55 in Eritrea is nominally liable for national service. And at any one time, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the adult population is serving in the military in one way or another. That means either on the front line, or they're working for contractors who are related to the Ministry of Defense, or they're working in other government ministries subcontracted from the Ministry of Defense. So the government has an absolute stranglehold on the whole economy, on the whole workforce, and on the whole population. There is a glimmer of hope for the Eritrean government because gold has been discovered at a mine called Bisha in northern Eritrea, which is currently producing gold at around $2.95 an ounce, which is, I think, the cheapest production cost in the world. So it's a great bet if you want to pick some stocks, but not a good bet in the long term, because one of the ways in which the Eritrean government is making money, and one of the reasons why that production cost is so low, is because the mine is one of the main contractors of that labor, that national service conscript labor from the Ministry of Defense. So there are an awful lot of allegations about, or not, allegations about forced labor used by this particular gold mine and others, and to the point where IGAD, the International Intergovernmental Authority for Development for the Horn of Africa, which is all of Eritrea's neighbors, has called for sanctions on Eritrea, and particularly on the mining companies that are exploiting the mining sector in Eritrea. Those are some of the issues in Eritrea. Let me briefly talk about Djibouti. Djibouti is the kind of crux of my region of the Horn of Africa that I focus on for Human Rights Watch, because you have Eritrea up here and Ethiopia, and then Djibouti, and then Somalia, and then Kenya down there. But three countries border Djibouti, so it's kind of key. As I mentioned, Japan opened a military base last week in Djibouti at the cost of 4 billion yen, and there are, I think, about 160 troops there. The main focus is supporting the Japanese Navy in its anti-piracy efforts along the Somali coast and around the Red Sea. I mentioned stability earlier, and I think this is a very good example of a place where Japan should be very concerned about long-term stability in Djibouti. If you've invested 4 billion yen in a military base, you want that base to be there for a period of time. And you also, I suppose, I would hope, want that government, want the people there at least, to accept your presence. Now, the risk that Japan runs is the same that the French and the Americans run, both of whom have very large bases in Djibouti, which is to become overly identified with the regime and therefore to be seen as part of the problem. Djibouti has had the same president he's just started his third term. He changed the constitution so that he could run for another term. He ran unopposed because the opposition boycotted the elections in May this year. Prior to the elections, there was a kind of Arab Spring moment where lots of people were protesting every Friday, calling for Gule to step down. That was met with a crackdown. The leader of the leading human rights organization in Djibouti was put in jail. Many opposition leaders were put in jail as well. Eventually, some of them were released. And we commented on that. Very few Western nations or other nations criticized the conduct of Djibouti's government, even when Djibouti kicked out the monitors that were funded by the US government, who were supposed to be there to monitor the elections. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if over time, as the Gule government digs its heels in and perhaps extends its term for a fourth term, you may find people starting to talk about Djibouti's reliance on foreign military powers, on the presence of foreign military in Djibouti, and the contributing factors that that lends to the authoritarianism there. There's been a lot of there was at that time harsh words about the Americans and the French, but if the Japanese presence is there endures or expands, then you can expect, I think, Japan to come under criticism as well. All of those three countries are in effect one-party states, dictatorships, I think, in one way or another. And there will be serious concerns about stability when those leaders leave, because they will leave or they'll die. And when they do, whether or not you have another person who emerges from within the party structure, whether you have a relative, whether you have actually, a new dispensation, some kind of social change. Ethiopia has never seen a peaceful change of government. It had an emperor, Haile Selassie, till 1974. Then he was overthrown and the Derg military regime persisted until 1991 in a coup. The existing government has had so many splits where people who were in the rebel group have peeled off and formed all of their own opposition movements. I think the hollow core of what remains of the Ethiopian government is actually very, very fragile. And there's an awful lot of concern that when Meles Zenawi goes, it could be a real mess, because Ethiopia is a difficult collection of Muslims, Christians, many different ethnic groups, with all sorts of interests in Sudan, in Eritrea, in Somalia, around it. So there are serious concerns about stability and what one might mean by stability. So we would hope, and we would argue, for a soft landing over time, that you should encourage reforms, respect for human rights, so that that happens gently. The other two countries I'm just going to say a little bit about is Kenya and Somalia. Somalia has become a kind of battleground for a proxy war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Eritrea was given independence from Ethiopia at the end of the Derg regime in 1991. Since then, Ethiopia and Eritrea have been to war twice over the disputed border, and now they choose to fight their differences in Somalia. Eritrea has been funding the terrorist group Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Ethiopia has been funding a different militia called Al-Sunnah wal Jamal, who have been allied to the UN-backed government and fighting Al-Shabaab. So they've been kind of fighting each other through these proxies in Somalia. The Somali conflict is more complicated than that, but that's an element of it. There's been no government since 1991 in Somalia. At the moment, there is this UN-backed government, the Transitional Federal Government, which depends completely on the UN and international donors for its support. And it depends completely on African Union peacekeepers, the African mission to Somalia called AMISOM, to survive and to protect it from Al-Shabaab. It only controls a small part of Mogadishu at the moment. So it's really just a kind of paper government. Piracy, which I think everybody's heard about, has become much more of a media issue than actually the situation in Somalia, is really just a consequence of the fact that Somalia has had no government since 1991. Piracy, it's perhaps also a consequence of the natural entrepreneurial spirit of the Somali people. But it's become big business. The interesting thing, I think, for other countries is how it's dealt with. At the moment, Japan's deployed its navy, so has the EU, there's constant US ships around. But under international maritime law, if you catch if you catch a pirate at sea and you want to try them, you're either supposed to take them back to your country, or you need to give them to a third country, which is in effect an extradition, to which they have an appeal under international law. So there's been a real problem with actually dealing with those pirates, with prosecuting and putting them behind bars. So what happens when all of these navies are circulating is basically catch and release. So what they're doing at the moment is catching Somali pirates, disarming them, burning their boats, and then putting them back on land. And it's only a matter of time before they buy more weapons and another boat and then go and hijack another ship. So at the moment, piracy is at an all-time high, as the number of Navy ships in the Gulf, in the Red Sea and the Somali coast has increased. And the more ships that are deployed and the more ships that are hijacked and the higher ransoms go with inflation, the more the issue becomes a media point of attention in the West, the more they can claim more money, the more, et cetera, et cetera. So the real long-term solution to Somalia is actually on land, is trying to some extent, and I know it's very difficult, to find a settlement for Somalia among the different warring militias. There have been numerous agreements, the most recent of which is the Kampala Accords, to try and get some peace deal there. The way in which I think that settlement will come is with much more support for those international agreements amongst all of the clans, and we believe a process of accountability for what's happened in the war so far. So one of the main things Human Rights Watch is calling for is for a commission of inquiry, a UN commission of inquiry to be established with a mapping exercise to map all of the massacres and violations and so on that have occurred so far, a lot of the grievances that the different clans hold, and to set it all down and to then use that as a basis for some kind of accountability in the future and as some kind of deterrent, so that the warring groups know that when peace does eventually come, there will be a day of reckoning. Lastly, let me mention Kenya. There were controversial elections in 2007, 2008. And although the country appears to be at peace at the moment, there's an awful lot of rumblings under the surface. There are unimaginably corrupt politicians at the helm of the Kenyan government. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. That sets the tone for a largely unequal society. And when people are poor, when things are unequal, they look to traditional safety nets as a way of surviving. And that has always been land. The British got rid of a lot of land. They stole a lot, and then they sold a lot to different tribal groups in Kenya. So the actual available land for people as a safety net is shrinking and diminishing. So a lot of the political violence that we've seen lately, and that I think we will see again in Kenya, centers on land and is sparked by land, and especially by irresponsible politicians who incite that violence as a way of ethnically cleansing their areas so that they can solidify voting blocks so that they can get into power. So although Kenya may appear to be a growing economy and fairly peaceful, there are quite a lot of rumblings under the surface. The next elections, incidentally, are in 2012, and that will be a point to watch. I just wanted to give you an overview in a bit more depth of those countries, because those are the countries I cover for Human Rights Watch. But what I'd like to do with what remains, how much longer do I have? 10 minutes, okay. Is to just cover a couple of points about business and human rights, and then mention a couple of points about things to watch out for. Where do we go? The scramble for African resources has always been beset with controversy, from the rubber plantations of King Leopold II in Congo, which led to the first global human rights movement and the boycotting of red rubber, to gold mining in Congo these days, and conflict diamonds, blood diamonds, the Kimberley process, and so on. Now, as I said before, I feel that, development assistance and international attention, as well as business, can be either a force for good or a force for bad. And sometimes the difference between the two is actually not very much. So what I'd like to say is, for those of you who perhaps in the future are working for multinational institutions that have interests in Africa, that are investing there, a couple of major things. The first one is, see these governments for what they are. Listen to the people, not the governments that claim to represent them. Because ultimately, the problems that a business has over there will be to do with the populations on the ground. They are the ones who have the capacity to cause trouble, to create instability. They're the ones who will be upset, who will, sabotage installations, or who will garner rebel movements and so on. The governments, although they may claim to represent the interests of the people, often don't. So some things to note. Is the land being offered theirs to sell or theirs to rent? Who was there before? Land tenure in Africa is often very, very complex. Many different groups might claim the right to use that land, even if they don't own that land. The government may say, it's fine, here's the title deed. In fact, there's no such thing as a title deed. It's customary land under the Constitution, and anybody can use it. Do your due diligence, know about these things, know the context. Were the people there moved consensually? Were they compensated? Were they moved violently? What were they promised? What was delivered? Even though none of that may appear to be of interest or relevant to a company. In fact, it's highly relevant. I'm sure it's highly relevant in many contexts, but what I've seen from large-scale infrastructure projects in Africa is that these things are often not considered, and companies say, well, the government told us it was fine, it's none of our business. Where does the labor come from? Particularly the example of Eritrea. Are those people coming freely? Are they fairly paid? Is it a fair process? Is it one group being employed at the expense of another group? What can you do to improve the health or provide services that the government isn't providing? I did some work with a friend who runs a consultancy in Southern Africa, where he persuaded all the mining companies to introduce free ARVs and HIV testing for his population, and his retention went up. Instead of his workforce dying, they were living. And he didn't think that that would be an interest, that would be something that the companies would be interested in, but they were, they took it up. Who's providing security at the plant? Is it the police? Do you trust the police? What sort of reputation do the police have? You know, our idea, perhaps, in democratic or developed nations of what the state is and what you can believe of the state when it speaks, I think is perhaps sometimes quite naive, and in that context, very, very different. The legitimate interests of the people are often very, very different from what the state says or may claim. So really just thinking about the human rights of the people that you're working with and that you're living beside, because by thinking about them, you will do yourself a favor, you will do them a favor, and you'll have a much better understanding of the situation into which you're walking. A couple of examples of bad practice or things that have come to our attention at Human Rights Watch. I'm sure you're familiar with the role of China in Sudan, where China pretty much supported the North in its war against the South, mainly because and a big part of the grievance of the South and the war was, in fact, the SPLA felt that the Chinese NCP oil fields were precisely the areas around which the northern Arab government was committing ethnic cleansing in order to pave the way for that exploration. So even though the Sudanese government may come to the Chinese NCP and say, well, here's your block, feel free to explore, the Chinese claimed to have no awareness of what had gone on before. It didn't matter. As far as the people there were concerned, they're responsible. And therefore, later, when the SPLA starts attacking oil fields, there's a very real direct historical link. There's a very real reason why that happened. They built roads which disrupted traditional nomadic pastoralist routes. They contaminated water with their exploration, all of which builds grievances. Even if it was the government's responsibility to do those things, you're implicated, or at least the NCP in that circumstance was implicated. Again, China and Petronas in Ogaden in the south of Ethiopia. There's been a secession war in the southern Ethiopian province of Somali region. For nearly 40 years now, they've been fighting central government because they want independence. Similar thing was going on. The Ethiopian government was doing ethnic cleansing in the areas around the oil fields in order to present clean blocks for Petronas and for the CNOC. People thought that oil was part of the reason for the war, and then again they started attacking the installations. So in April 2007, 9 Chinese workers were kidnapped and killed, along with 65 Ethiopians. They relied on the Ethiopian army for security instead of having their own security guards. So again, immediately implicated in that situation. Shell in Nigeria, I'm sure, is an example that's very familiar to you. Ken Saro-Wiwa and the abuses by the military, to the point where rebel movements saw no difference. MEND, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, saw no difference between Shell and the government. And the government, in fact, saw very little difference between its own military and Shell security guards and treated the two as the same. But there are other examples. I've come across one recently called Seven Energy, which is doing gas exploration in the Niger Delta. They're looking at 30-year investment horizons, and therefore they're investing significant parts of their profits into NGO partnerships, schools, hospitals, and so on, and building, most importantly, relationships with the people there. And so far it seems to be working there. None of their installations have been attacked. We've had quite a lot of engagement with Barrick Gold in Papua New Guinea. Again, environmental contamination. They were relying on the local police, who were raping local women, as well as guarding their mine. So because of the mine, they needed more police. The police then living in the area were conducting systematic rape in the population there. We persuaded them that they should train their own security guards and not rely on the police, and immediately their community relations are improving. So again, they saw that as part of their agreement with the government. They didn't realize the human rights consequences of having a large number of undisciplined policemen in their area. I've already mentioned gold in Congo. Coltan in Congo is another problem that's caused, another resource that has caused an awful lot of the fighting in Congo. The US passed a law, you may be aware, on sourcing of coltan from Congo and the use of coltan in transistors and electronics. I mean, that may have had some supply chain issues for Japanese companies here, I'm not sure, but that was very directly related to human rights research and the role that coltan was playing in funding some of those rebel groups. So again, quite a direct link, worth being aware of, you know, the context. A couple of things to watch, finally, as I wrap up. Land grabbing has become quite a big issue that's received a lot of media attention lately. Tanzania, Uganda, Mozambique, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Zambia, Ghana, Gambia, Liberia, they're all selling land, large areas of land, issues of food security, and you know, people wanting to grow their own food, but also agricultural export. Unprecedented amounts of land are being made available, but there are a number of cautions. What we've seen of the process in Ethiopia, and I don't know to what extent this is relevant in other countries, but it may be, is forced displacement, people being moved out of areas of land, people being promised food aid, or in some circumstances pastoralists who are being told that they will be taught how to farm, and until they learn how to farm they'll be given food aid. But the food aid hasn't arrived, and so they're starving to death. Meanwhile, their land is being ploughed by an Indian company that's growing sesame. We've had reports of slave wages as well, the government promising very, very low wages and then actually forcing people to go and work, or in some cases, if you've starved them, they will work for the slave wages anyway because they need the money. But that's a very complicated economic relationship that the company perhaps doesn't understand or hasn't really thought through, hasn't really looked into. The other big issue in Ethiopia is the Gibe 3 and the Gibe 4 dams. There's a big river in southern Ethiopia called Omo, and it flows into Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. If the Ethiopians dam that river, the livelihood of the Turkana people will be severely affected. Not only that, but the area that they want to dam is an area in which lots of quite unique, culturally distinct people live, like the Mercy, the Bodhi. There's a group of different Ethiopian, quite small numbers of people that are very ethnically distinct, and whom groups like Cultural Survival have paid a lot of attention to. Their livelihoods will be affected. They'll effectively be put out of business. Those two are from Ethiopia. Two other examples from other parts. The one company that I came across that is Japanese is called Toyota Tetsua, and they are in discussions with South Sudan and Kenya about building a pipeline for South Sudanese oil from Juba down to Lamu, the port on the Kenyan border, on the Kenyan border with Somalia on the Indian Ocean coast. This would be, I think, Kenya's first deep water port, possibly the deepest on the East African seaboard. It's $1.5 billion. Lamu is a very fragile ecosystem. Again, you'd probably have to move people. There are all sorts of human rights concerns related to any big infrastructure development. So, you know, if there's anybody from Toyota Tetsua here, or you're working with them, the initial points apply. Do your homework. Look at the context. Make sure the environmental impact study is done, not just to the standards of the Kenyan government, but to the standards of the Japanese government. You know, the people there will want to see that you care about them, not that you're simply relying on what the government says they need or what the government says they want. And finally, a good news story from Kenya that I heard about recently was Samsung, who are looking at Africa as a market the same size as China for electronic goods by 2015. One of the things that they're doing along with their expansion of activities in Africa is building a research lab at the Strathmore University in Nairobi, where they intend to train 10,000 electronic engineers over the next 5 years. So that immediately has won Samsung massive plaudits in Kenya. It's not really related to human rights, but it's doing a good thing. It appears to be doing a good thing. My final sentence, if I may. I've gone on longer than I thought, but one of the things I've noticed about visiting Japan in the last 2 days, in the last week rather, is that I think it's not really a Japanese diplomatic tradition to speak out on human rights, to comment on what they see as internal affairs, the politics of another country. And what I said to people on another panel the other day is that it's very important to realize, and it's a lesson which we're only just getting other governments to acknowledge. Human rights is not politics. Every constitution, pretty much now in the world, every constitution has fundamental protections about human rights. And those are standard, those are basic. That's about the rule of law. Political parties and how people choose to organize themselves is a whole different matter. Commenting on human rights is not commenting on politics. It's not, you know, as the Chinese seem to believe in the way that they operate in Africa, it's not impolite or rude to talk about human rights. And certainly the people there will appreciate you for doing so. The other thing I've noticed in my engagements with diplomats and with foreign policy makers in Africa is that foreign policy naturally reflects domestic values. And I think Japan is a democracy. So to some extent, it's natural that its foreign policy will reflect more democratic values, will hold more respect for human rights. I think it's no surprise that Japan has a very different approach to Africa, a more low-key one, a less entitled one, perhaps, than China does. Because China's foreign policy, and to some extent, reflects its domestic policy. So, as business people, if you want your government to support sustainable investments in Africa, I think you can play a role in encouraging that culture shift, in encouraging that modernization of perspective to overcome that traditional conservatism and reservations about speaking about human rights. Because as Japan has more of a role in Africa, it seeks more from Africa, it has therefore more responsibilities as well. And what comes with that is speaking out about the interests of the people. So I think the future is bright for Africa, and I think for those that want to invest there, but in order for it to remain bright, it must be done right. That's the end of my chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rollins, for your very insightful presentation. Now we'll move on to the second part of tonight's event. I would like to open the floor for Q&A. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand. Please, I'll hand the mic to you because we're broadcasting this over the internet. Thank you. Please raise your hand.
Thank you. My name is Cecil Masoka. I'm from the Embassy of South Africa. There are a few points I'd like to make. Firstly is that, Mr. Rawlings, I think you yourself have failed to actually look at the context before you make sweeping statements. And secondly, I think the video is stereotyping in the sense that given the historical background that the African countries come from and the 3-year history of colonization, there are certain things that needs to be accounted for before you can make such observations and sweeping statements. The third point is basically related to you downplaying the role that the donor funders or international communities actually playing. Of course, you talk about what needs to be accounted for in terms of what goes in as funding, in terms of capacity development for specific journalists and major chunks of funding going to social services. That's well and good, but I think the issue, the fundamental issue is that there are certain political connotations that drive that kind of investment or that drive that kind of donor funding into certain specific countries. And lastly, I think when you say listen to the people, I've got a lot of things that I can ask about. But when you say listen to the people, I'm from South Africa. Now, if you're saying that, should the Japanese companies go and ask the Afrikaners or the British whites before they ask me? That will be the question I'll ask.
Okay. I need a bit more detail from you on context. If you say I've failed to look at the context, what do you mean?
I think you're talking about specifically, let me go to the video itself. The video talks about Congo.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about Congo, if you go to the Leopold era, or, before Leopold, what was the state of affairs in Congo? That's how you contextualize the politics in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
Now, then you have Leopold or the Europeans coming into Africa. And what then happened. Now, without that contextualization, it's very, very important, especially in this particular context, because I've been in Japan for 4 years. I can tell you, on my arrival in 2007, very few people understood where South Africa was.
Yeah.
Until 2010, when we hosted the World Cup. Now, clearly, that tells you that when you make this kind of a presentation, you have to be very careful about the presentation itself, the focus, the historical background, the context, and whether the people that you are presenting to actually have the information themselves on certain things. Because the presentation or the video is about Congo, your examples predominantly and your specialty areas predominantly around Somalia. Yeah. There's a reference to South Africa along the way, Djibouti, Kenya, and then we go to Nigeria on the Niger Delta. So we're oscillating all over the continent.
I see what you mean, okay.
And that's a very, very dangerous space, basically.
All right, let's have another question, and then maybe I'll take 3, and then I'll respond. Yeah.
Andreas Border, I'm also a student here at Globus. I also want to come back to the issue because what I think the real reason why this all happened is not because the government over there is a one-party government or whatsoever. I think the interest into these natural resources of Africa, they are mainly driven by governments which are not located there, or maybe not governments, but companies and whatsoever. And I think the real solution to solve a number of conflicts over there is not in Africa, but somewhere else. And I don't know what Human Rights Watch is doing there. It could be maybe also an issue for sure to I would say elaborate on the issues, because they are happening there, that's clear. But the real source or the real reason of all of those things is somewhere else. And I think it needs to be done a lot of more work in other places and that world to really calm down these conflicts over there. Thank you.
Okay. One more? Yeah.
My name is Felix. I'm from Congo, DRC.
Yeah.
I saw your video. Well, you're from working for human rights, okay? But it's so easy to say, okay, that the problem is the war is because of the mineral resources and the government is not so good and so on. But why don't you tell the people that the people you're calling poor people, because from the video, nobody can imagine that a villager can buy a weapon who's supposed to be $100, at least the cheapest one. So why don't you explain how come these people got weapons to fight each other? Then when you will explain that, they will understand why Chinese now are welcome in Africa. Because no Chinese are selling weapons. Chinese are coming and doing business, which any country will want to do, because they are not Africans, they are not Congolese, they just want China to be better for a better living of the Chinese, which is normal. So why don't you explain to the Japanese that there are people, you, coming to Africa, selling weapons to Africa, telling them fight, and then you're taking mineral resources. Why you want Japanese to come and be polite when you're not polite? And why you want Japanese to come now and be polite?
Okay. Yeah. Let me answer those three, and then we'll take some more. Okay. I don't need that. I was waiting for that, but I don't need it, do I? Okay. Those 2 points, I think, are somehow related. The interest in natural resources lie elsewhere, and the solution lies elsewhere, and that the weapons are coming from the West, Europe, the US, Britain. It's Tony. I would like to blame Tony Blair for a lot, but the UK doesn't make AK-47s, unfortunately. It's more complicated than I've said. It's more complicated than that as well. It's very complicated. The beginning sentence in that video was, Congo is a rich country, right? Which it is. It's the richest country in the world in terms of natural resources. 90% of the world's minerals are in Congo. There is no reason the Congolese people should be suffering the way that they're suffering. The war that is still going on in Congo is a continent-wide kind of world war in which Namibia was involved, Zimbabwe was involved, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania to some extent, Sudan, Libya. Everybody wanted a piece of the pie. It was fueled by international interest in those minerals, in companies, including Chinese, jockeying for control and position of various rebel groups, different areas of the country trying to get resources. The US and the UK encouraged Rwanda and Uganda to invade in 1994. They paid for that. They did supply weapons, it's true. At the same time, all of these other countries were also involved. And those rebel groups derived their income from natural resources, from all sorts of other things, trading, which they then used to buy more weapons. So it's a messy business. You know, I think that Europe certainly has a case to answer for in initiating that first invasion in '94. The fact that the war, after Mobutu went and the war continued and there were all these continuing problems, you know, we're not saying, you know, just because I'm British doesn't mean Human Rights Watch defends Britain. You know, I would never defend Britain to begin with. So what we do, and yes, then this leads back to the first question, yes, that video is inevitably going to be somehow stereotyping, because the war in Congo was one of the worst wars of recent years, perhaps the worst in terms of the numbers of people killed. It has been very much in the media spotlight, and unfortunately images like those have been in the media spotlight. I would like to see many more different images of Africa and my friends and the people I work with out there in the media. Unfortunately, so far, especially on Congo, that has been the dominant experience. So yes, I'm afraid, yes, that video and the talking about human rights violations is you know, a stereotype. I'm not here to give a lecture on colonial history or, you know, the involvement, the economic development of Africa over time. What I'm talking about is existing human rights problems in a certain number of places, and a little bit of my experience for the benefit of a predominantly Japanese audience. I completely accept. I think you and I would have an awful lot to agree on about the role of the British in South Africa, about the role of the British across the country, across the continent, and outside influences. I think the colonial historical context in terms of setting up the structures of power in Africa has an awful lot to answer for. I think South Africa has had an incredible experience, rather like Japan, coming out of a very oppressive situation into a more plural democratic situation where now you have a representative government. I would never say that, I would never describe the South African government as anything other than a democracy, and I think a democratic government, to the best extent it can, does represent the interests of its people. Nonetheless, when you invest in a country, it's very different taking for granted the word of the government and the word of the people, where you're working, where you're living, the people you're working alongside, the people you're hiring, and so on. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying that governments should be ignored. I'm just saying that they're not the only people you should take into account. That's what I'm saying, is that you also need to listen to the other groups, the civil society groups, the community organizations. Listen to the people that you're with. In terms of international funds being accountable and coming with political connotations, absolutely. And if we want to get into the economic and historical circumstances of conflict and the reasons behind human rights abuses, like I say, I think we'd agree on an awful lot. The development assistance that comes, especially to Ethiopia, is entrenching an autocratic regime and encouraging human rights violations, especially because they look the other way, because they want to keep giving that money and they don't want to look at the violations. As I mentioned earlier about the Middle East, the West has had a long history of doing that, of not paying attention to human rights violations, of trading with the apartheid regime and bolstering them and selling them weapons and not talking about human rights. The same with, Cold War regimes like Mengistu in Ethiopia, like what are they called in Mozambique? You would remember the name better than me. Frelimo, the opposite of Frelimo. In Mozambique, in the Cold War in Angola, where South Africa was playing a role. So there is all sorts of bad influence and negative experiences in Africa, as there have been, I think, in other parts of the world. But that's not to say that all of those things are bad. I think, as my friend agreed, some of that development funding is positive. Some of it is being used in a good way. It does come with generally neoliberal policy prescriptions, which have negative effects and can promote instability and sometimes don't always promote development as well. So I think all of those things should be taken into account, and I don't think there's an awful lot of disagreement there. I apologize for the fact that this is a sweeping discussion, but that's the nature of it. And if you do want to find out more, then I'm sure on any particular country, I'm certainly willing to talk about it, and I'm sure our friends will be willing to talk about their countries in more detail too. Can we take some more questions?
Please raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Takuro from Globis. I have a question for future action of the Human Rights Watch. If you look at the conflict in Africa, as you say, that's so complicated and there's so many problems. But I think one problem is there is so many small weapons over there. AK-47 is too much over there. So, like Japan did a project 2006 that in Congo they gather and they collected small arms and they burn it. But through the video, I understood that the Human Rights Watch, they have power to find out the human violation, and they stop them to do it. But do you have any action for the future that if you know that there's already too many small weapons, can you correct or can you make it not to be used? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take another couple.
So, thank you very much for the presentation. And I think in Japan, a few years ago, Doi Kanai-san opened the branch of Human Rights Watch here, right? So after that, what do you think, how the activity in Japan changed, and then how we are sending messages to the countries or dictators who is violating the international law, and then do you have any advice how we can be good at speaking out, because our culture is not good at speaking out, as you know. So yeah. So, and do you have any honest feedback that for Japan or Japanese government? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, another one, and then only if there's no one else. Let me take him, and then let's come back to you. Two, sorry. One at the back, and then I will remember you.
I was impressed by your speech. I'm Atsushitara from Globis. How do you think about the African advocacy system, African local advocacy system? Because 4 years ago, I was doing voluntary teacher in Kenya, and I saw many dependents of local people to Western NPO. So, for example, in Congo or any other African countries, their problem should be solved by themselves. So their problem should be solved by their own advocacy system. For example, their journalists or their medias and so on. So how do you think about that? And how do you collaborate with local medias or journalists?
Okay. And can we take this guy as well? And then I'll answer those, and then, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. And my name is Kosuke from one of the trading companies in Japan. And I just wanted to ask, I think you've give us an example of good companies who's doing a good job in Africa in terms of business, like LG as an example, LG. I just wanted to ask if you have any other examples of companies from the viewpoint of human rights who is doing a good job in cooperating with locals and progressing the business, and also what makes them so special or outstanding in doing so.
Okay, thank you. Small weapons, yes, I think that's definitely a big part of the problems that Human Rights Watch has seen, and definitely in terms of violations. The underlying causes, as we talked about, is something else. But the presence of small weapons means that those causes are easily spiral into other problems if weapons are easily available. There are a number of programs to minimize small weapons. The UN has a small arms program. There's an independent small arms survey in Geneva as well. I mean, we cooperate with those organizations to the extent that we share information and stuff like that. Our role is merely recording and reporting. We don't, collect weapons or do anything like that. There are big programs in Congo, for example. There was a government UN program called DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, where people were offered money and seeds and tools in order to hand in their guns. Large numbers of weapons were destroyed. So, these programs are happening. And I think the most effective ones, jumping to the other question about people's own solutions, the most effective ones are the ones where people themselves in those areas are are involved. The most effective DDR process I ever saw was in Katanga in eastern Congo, where there was a local group that was offering food bags for weapons. And that, in the end, the UN came and got involved, and then the government took over. But that was one of the first, where they decided that they had enough of the militia, and they said, if we bring you bags, will you give us our guns and your guns? And then one by one, it happened. So I firmly believe in that kind of local action. Just to give you some other examples, absolutely, the local journalist and local media is crucial, absolutely crucial. And a large part of what we do is working with local NGOs, local journalists, and highlighting when they face problems, because as an international organization, we have another level of profile that we can bring to those problems. So, for example, in Ethiopia, there's been a very repressive civil society law which has made human rights work basically impossible in Ethiopia. So a lot of the indigenous human rights organizations in Ethiopia that were doing this kind of reporting, they've gone out of business. They had to close 12 or out of 9 offices. About 20 or 30 people have fled the country. There are now 8 journalists in jail in Ethiopia. 8 journalists were jailed in the last 2 weeks. That brings the total in Ethiopia to around 30 of journalists who are in jail. The free press in Ethiopia has been pretty much destroyed. So where those systems don't exist, where there isn't the local civil society to hold people to account, we have more of a role to play, we would feel. But where they do exist, our role is to try and promote them and work with them. So, for example, in Kenya, there's several networks of NGOs that we work with, and we now do less work in Kenya as a result because they are doing that stuff. In Congo, we've put together several, again, networks of local NGOs. We've done lots of training so that those NGOs now, when there are rights violations, all of our press releases come out usually with a coalition, a collection of Congolese NGOs who are saying, this is what we found. And we say, well, this is what we've heard, and it corresponds with what they've heard. And it has more impact because there's more of us saying it. So absolutely, it's a dynamic process. We're all trying to work for the same end, and we're all, doing those things together. In terms of other companies that are doing a good job, I don't really know is the answer, because it's not my main area of expertise is finding out the bad guys. Those are the ones, the cases that come to my desk that we hear about. There are plenty, just from my own kind of interest, I've heard of plenty of good initiatives where companies are doing well. One of them was this health initiative with all the mining companies in Tanzania, where they were paying for ARVs and things like that, which seems like a good idea to me. But I would argue that the basic principles are what's important. Are you paying a living wage that is enough in that economy? Are you looking after your people? Are you giving them security of tenure? All the sorts of things that you would expect for yourself. I think different standards don't apply. Just because it's a parallel economy where things are cheaper. And in terms of the Japanese office and the Japanese foreign ministry and so on, I think we've had quite an impact with the Japanese government in particular, with Doi Kanai-san and pushing our agenda with them. The former foreign minister, for example, I know was very sympathetic, and we had quite a lot of success in changing the way in which he engaged, and he was much more willing to speak out about human rights issues and so on. I think that, of course, political discourse in any given country is very culturally specific. And it doesn't mean that you have to change the discourse, but you have to find ways within the discourse of changing the message. And I think the people who know how to do that are the people concerned, is the Japanese. And I think, in my country, if in the way that British politics works, if I want to influence British politics, firstly, I probably go to the press. Secondly, I engage with politicians, we write to politicians, and ask our MPs in the Parliament to put questions to the government. And then the government starts moving and then issues responses and says, this is what we've done. And for example, for professional organizations that lobby the British Parliament, they know that you only need to write letters to about 50 MPs, and then the government takes things seriously and it will take an action. So I don't know if there's people who are involved in public affairs and public relations with lobbying the Japanese government, but I'm sure there are strategies and normal codes of conduct about ways of doing things. If you want to lobby the Japanese government on something, what would one do? What would those normal steps be? I mean, that's what I would suggest to somebody who's concerned about these issues, would be to apply the same formula. Any more questions, or are we done? We're over time. Okay. Thank you for listening. I hope it was stimulating, even if somewhat controversial. And I'd be pleased to answer questions afterwards if that's of interest. Thanks.